Hello everyone, in this video we're going to talk about cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is the process that releases energy from food in the presence of oxygen. So the purpose of cellular respiration is to produce energy for us, and obviously there's food that's required and oxygen is also required. When there's no oxygen, cellular respiration cannot happen. So who does it? Every single living thing does it, right? In eukaryotic organisms, we use mitochondria for cellular respiration. When we say mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, it's because mitochondria is what turns glucose or other type of food molecule into ATP, which is the energy that our cells can use. However, for organisms that do not have a mitochondria, for example, for bacteria, they can still do cell respiration and produce energy for themselves. They just have to go through sort of a modified, different type of mechanism, and you don't really need to know the details about that. So cell respiration allows a controlled release of energy. That word controlled release is really, really important because ATP is what produces us with energy. And why don't we just have ATP all over the place? Why don't we just eat ATP? The reason for that is because ATP breaks down into ADP very easily, and that's not a controlled release of energy. The energy is released really fast, right? Another example is burning. So if you're burning a marshmallow, you can see that there is light being released and there's heat being released, and all the energy of that marshmallow in the bonds in the marshmallow are breaking, and as those energy is being released, heat and light is also released. Right? But this process happens really fast. If this process happens so fast in our body, then all the food that we eat, first off, we're going to be a burning fireball, which is not good. But also, the energy will be released so fast that you have to be eating all day long, and you can't even keep up with the energy demand. So all the cellular respiration process, breaking down glucose slowly and completely allows us to harvest as much energy from glucose as possible, and it allows us to kind of have the controlled release, a slow release of energy. So overall, for cell respiration, we start with glucose. That's what we're putting into cell respiration. What we're making during cell respiration is we want to make a lot of ATP so that our cells can use that ATP energy really fast, right? Because our cells need that energy right now. And even when you're not eating, you have glucose stored in your body to allow ATP to be made for your cells. And then in the end, what is the point of making all that ATP is to use that ATP for cellular activities. So the next one is the difference between cell respiration and photosynthesis. So if you look at this picture that we already talked about in class, photosynthesis, takes in water and carbon dioxide and makes glucose and oxygen. So cell respiration kind of does the opposite. Cell respiration has to take in glucose because that's the food that photosynthesis is trying to produce for the plants itself, right? So the food is there, and the plant stores food as glucose instead of ATP because glucose can store that energy for a lot longer and not release that energy right away. So this glucose plus oxygen go through cell respiration and make mainly ATP, makes a little bit of heat, which is beneficial for us as human beings and other warm-blooded animals because we need a certain temperature for body heat. And then at last, we make water and carbon dioxide. So you should know that the reactants for photosynthesis are the products for cell respiration, and the product of photosynthesis is the reactant for cell respiration. This actually makes sense because the point of plants doing photosynthesis, why is plants doing photosynthesis in the first place, is because plants want to make food for itself from the sunlight energy it's getting, right? Well, not once, it still happened, right? Plants can make that food for itself, and then that food can then be used for cell respiration at the moment and later on. So at night, when plants cannot do photosynthesis, those stored sugar can be used for cell respiration. So again, right here is our overall reaction of photosynthesis, and here is the overall reaction of cell respiration. You should definitely know these two reactions very well by this point. This one we went over in class, bonds store energy. You should know that bonds store energy, and when you break a bond, you release a lot of energy. Why is that important? Glucose, the reason why glucose has energy to release is because there are a lot of bonds in glucose that we can break, right? It's not as simple as just breaking one bond and two bonds. There's a whole lot that's going on that we're not even going to talk about because it's so complicated. But you should know that when glucose is being processed and that energy being released from glucose is then being used to make ATP. Okay, so if that's a little confusing, let's take a look at this picture right here. We know that ADP is made into ATP by adding a phosphate group, but in order to add that phosphate group, in order to form this extra bond, you have to have an input of energy. This process going from ADP to ATP requires energy. All right, but where does this energy come from? We said during cell respiration, we're making ATP, right? We're making this molecule, which means we're going through this process of turning ADP into ATP. But where does that energy come from? It comes from the bonds of glucose. As we're breaking the bonds of glucose, this energy is then going to go to ATP and make a bond right here. Oh, ADP, make a bond with ADP in order to form ATP. So here it is. Formation of ATP requires energy. Where does it come from? It comes from the bonds being broken in glucose. The next one is the mitochondria structure. There are five structures that you need to know about, okay? We have the cristae. Cristae are the folds of the inner membrane. So this fold of the inner membrane is a cristae. This is a cristae. This is a cristae. This is a cristae. The next one is called the matrix. Matrix is all the way inside of both the outer membrane, which is the dark pink, and the inner membrane, which is the light pink. So inside both of those, we have the matrix. The next one we have is the outer membrane of mitochondria. That is the dark pink on the outside. That's the outer membrane. Mitochondria has two membranes. And then we have the inner membrane, which is the light pink, which makes up the cristae, and then it's the lining of the mitochondria matrix. The last one that's not written on here, we did in class, is called the intermembrane space. So the intermembrane space is between the outside, the dark pink, and the inside, the light pink. The next thing that we want to talk about is the steps of aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration means this respiration process, this ATP production process, requires oxygen. That's why we call it aerobic. If it's anaerobic, it means this process is a process that doesn't require oxygen. So right here, as you can see on the right, there's three big steps of aerobic respiration. There's glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. So let's go through this. We have glucose as our reactant. There's 6 carbons right here. Glucose is broken into 2 molecules of pyruvate. So this is one pyruvate. This is another pyruvate. And each pyruvate has 3 carbons. So as you can see, 1, 2, 3. 3 carbons for one pyruvate. Here's 1, 2, 3. 3 carbons for another pyruvate. And then this pyruvate is going to be transported through the outer mitochondrial membrane and the inner mitochondrial membrane. And this pyruvate is going to be turned into acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is a molecule that has 2 carbons. And this acetyl-CoA is what actually is going to be incorporated into the Krebs cycle. It's going to enter the Krebs cycle. So it's not pyruvate that enters the Krebs cycle, it's the acetyl-CoA, okay? And where, from 3 carbon pyruvate to 2 carbon acetyl-CoA, where did that extra carbon go to? That 1 carbon became carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is breathed out, okay? During the Krebs cycle, acetyl-CoA is processed. We're breaking and forming bonds again, and some energy is also formed. Some energy is formed here as well. And then during this process, we also release some carbon dioxide. The last step is the product of, so this right here, right, pyruvate, product of glycolysis goes into the Krebs cycle. The product of the Krebs cycle is going to go to the electron transport chain. But you can also see there are arrows leading from glycolysis all the way to the electron transport chain. So what exactly is being moved to the electron transport chain? So these are the molecules called electron carriers. Because electron transport chain needs electrons, we need to send electron carriers with electrons to the electron transport chain. So this arrow represents the process of sending electron carriers to the electron transport chain and dropping off electrons at the electron transport chain. Same thing over here. And as you can see, the electron transport chain also involves oxygen directly. The Krebs cycle actually can't happen without oxygen, but oxygen is directly used in the electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain is the process that makes most of the energy for cell respiration. As we can see one more time, the 3 steps of glycolysis is 3 steps of aerobic respiration is glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain, including chemiosmosis, which we'll talk about more in depth. So let's do this together, okay? You're doing it in front of the screen, right? Right. Okay, so we start with our 6 fingers because glucose has 6 carbons. The first step of aerobic respiration or cell respiration, is called glycolysis, and then pyruvate processing, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. Again, glycolysis, since we break glucose into 2 pyruvates. Pyruvate processing, because each pyruvate is going to lose a carbon dioxide. Look, it's losing a carbon dioxide. Now we're making our 2 acetyl-CoAs. Krebs cycle, since we have 2 acetyl-CoAs, so one goes through Krebs cycle once, the other one goes through Krebs cycle once. So in total, 1 glucose is going to go through the Krebs cycle twice. And then the last step is the electron transport chain, which is really the electron carriers that go into the electron transport chain. All right, let's keep going. The difference, here's anaerobic respiration. As we said, glycolysis doesn't require oxygen. So glucose can be turned into pyruvic acid, even when there's no oxygen. However, some organisms, because the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain do need oxygen, then if there's no oxygen or if the organism isn't equipped to use oxygen, then it has to go through something called fermentation, or we can call it anaerobic respiration. There are 2 types of anaerobic respiration. One is called alcohol fermentation. One is called lactic acid fermentation. So lactic acid fermentation is what we as human beings actually do. The first one is called alcohol fermentation. This is what yeast does. It makes bread, beer, wine, liquor, all that. But most importantly for us is the bread. Yeast is able to do that because without oxygen, it can do alcohol fermentation. It doesn't produce as much energy for the amount of sugar that's being used, but it does produce enough energy in order for the yeast to live and produce carbon dioxide, which is what makes bread rise. The next one is called lactic acid fermentation. This is when, if you're doing intense exercise, the oxygen supply of your body can't keep up with how much oxygen is being used in your muscles. So in this case, your muscles is going to start doing fermentation instead of aerobic respiration. So it's going to do lactic acid fermentation in order to produce enough energy in the form of ATP for you when you're doing that exercise. This is really great, right? Even though you feel sore after exercising sometimes, this soreness tells you that your body did work really hard to produce all that ATP in order for you to actually do the exercise. All right, you can take a look at all these questions. We went over all of them, all right? So where do organisms get energy from food? Unless you're a plant, then you get it from sunlight. Why do all organisms need food? Because organisms need food to produce energy in the form of ATP. Why do macromolecules differ in the amount of energy they contain? Because there are different types and different amount of bonds in the chemical structure of that macromolecule. So for example, glucose has different amount of energy inside of it compared to fat, for example, lipid, butter, right? Because the amount of bonds and the type of bonds inside those molecules are different. What is cell respiration? It's a process of transforming food into ATP energy. The overall equation of cell respiration, you should be able to do that yourself. Make sure you are able to do that yourself for tomorrow's quiz and next week's test. What is the relationship between photosynthesis and cell respiration? The products of photosynthesis is the reactant for cell respiration and vice versa. How does the process of cell respiration maintain homeostasis at the cellular level? The process of cell respiration provides energy for our cells so that the cell activities can be maintained, right? But you can also think about for active transport, when we transport molecules against its concentration gradient, this process also needs cell respiration in order to produce ATP, so the ATP can do active transport. What's the difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration? The main difference is aerobic uses oxygen and anaerobic doesn't. What are the two types of anaerobic respirations? The two types are alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. Alcohol fermentation makes carbon dioxide and alcohol, and lactic acid fermentation makes lactic acid and carbon dioxide. But you should know, for aerobic respiration, which is the typical cell respiration, and the anaerobic respiration, including both lactic acid fermentation and alcohol fermentation, all three of those do glycolysis, okay? The last one, where does energy used to make ATP come from? The answer is already given to you because it's so important for you to know the answer of this question. So the ATP, in order to create ATP, the energy comes from the chemical bonds in glucose. And remember, when we break a bond, we lose energy, we release energy, and that energy is then absorbed by ADP to make ATP. Please remember, energy cannot be created or destroyed. So when you're making ATP and using some energy to make that ATP, that energy has to come from somewhere else. All right, review. We already know this. Moving on, this part, this little girl is eating a donut and she's very excited. She's getting energy. Great. All right, for the glycolysis, specific steps of glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. That's going to be in the next video.